Hello, you're watching Afternoon Live. I'm Martine Croxall. Today at 2. The Supreme Court rules legal permission will not be needed to end care for patients in a permanent vegetative state. Services scrapped in a timetable shake-up by Northern Rail begin running again, but passengers face more cancellations.
It's been cancelled at very short notice. I was expecting a train at 6:07 and it's been cancelled because of lack of drivers.
Voting's underway in Zimbabwe in the first general election since long-time President Robert Mugabe was ousted. More than 12,000 firefighters are tackling severe wildfires in California that have claimed the lives of 8 people. Coming up on Afternoon Live, all the sport with Reshman and success in the Tour still sinking in for Geraint Thomas.
Yeah, absolutely, Martine. Those celebrations roll on for Geraint Thomas after he became the first Welshman and the third Brit to win the Tour de France. He will also be considering a new and improved contract offer from Team Sky.
Reshman, thank you very much. And Ben has all the weather. Ben, you've upset a lot of people, and I know it's not really your fault.
No, and people were asking for rain as well, if you remember last week, Martine. But I have to say, heat wave was probably what many people were saying over the weekend. Very different weather, some really wet weather, more than a month's worth of rain in just a few hours. For some, windy weather too. So what's going to happen this week? Well, for some, that heat wave may return, and I will have all the details in about half an hour.
Ben, thank you very much. Also coming up, behind the seams at Max Mara. The former punk from Derby who's running the quintessentially Italian fashion brand. Hello, this is Afternoon Live. I'm Martine Croxall. The Supreme Court has confirmed that the approval of a judge is no longer needed in order to end the care of people who are in persistent vegetative states, as long as families and doctors agree to the decision. Many thousands of individuals are believed to be in such a condition with little or no hope of recovery. The decision applies in England and Wales and Northern Ireland. Our health correspondent Sophie Hutchinson reports.
It's estimated there are tens of thousands of people living in a vegetative or minimally conscious state in the UK. Patients with almost no prospect of recovery who are kept alive with artificially administered food and water. Until now, it was the courts who decided whether life-sustaining nutrition could be withdrawn. But today, the Supreme Court said there was no good reason for that.
We find nothing in the common law nor in any Act of Parliament that requires an application to be made.
The case overturns part of an important ruling from 1993 in relation to Tony Bland. He was left permanently unconscious after the Hillsborough disaster. That ruling said life-sustaining measures could only be stopped after applying to the courts. Today's ruling says such applications are not obligatory. Today's ruling is hugely significant for what are potentially thousands of families who find themselves in some of the most tragic situations. Those who agree with doctors that their loved ones should be allowed to die. They can now make that decision in the quiet of their home, in hospital or elsewhere, without the strain of having to go to court. This solicitor, who represents families who've had to fight for their loved ones in court, welcomes the ruling.
It's a really good decision for a sensible and compassionate society to allow doctors and families to get on and make decisions on behalf of their patient in their best interests.
But some are concerned that removing the safeguard of asking the court's permission could be dangerous.
These decisions are very difficult. They need to be made by specialists. Diagnoses are often wrong. The Court of Protection has overturned decisions before, and this is why we feel that this severely compromises the lives of these vulnerable patients.
The Supreme Court's decision only applies where families and doctors agree. Where there is disagreement, judges will still have to decide whether patients should be allowed to die. Sophie Hutchinson, BBC News.
Well, our legal affairs correspondent Clive Coleman is outside the Supreme Court now. And Clive, very symbolic decision today that's been a long time coming for a lot of campaigners.
Yeah, I think it's a really profound change in the law, Martine, because for years there's been a distinction when families and doctors have agreed that life-sustaining medical treatment should be withdrawn. Then they're able to do that without going for a court order, so for instance life-saving dialysis. But in relation to the artificial supply of food and water, then they have had to come to court and seek a court order. That's been the case since the Tony Bland case that Sophie mentioned in 1993. And actually, very few cases have come to court, so perhaps only 100 or so cases, I'm told by one barrister who practices in this area, over that period have come to court. Why have doctors been so reluctant to bring these cases to court? Well, it costs a lot of money. It can be £50,000, £100,000. It can take a long time, a year, and of course their medical practice will be scrutinised by a judge. So what it's meant is that tens of thousands of people have remained on life support when their relatives may have wanted that not to be the case and thought it wasn't in their best interest. So what this judgment gives us is real clarity. Those families in those dreadful situations, if they are in agreement with their doctors, these decisions can now be made. It will be much easier, but of course these cases cut across religious and ethical issues. Some will regard this as a hugely compassionate and humane ruling. Others will regard it as the removal of a vital safeguard from a very vulnerable group of people.
And so, Clive, for those people who do regard this as immensely controversial, unethical even, what more might they do legally to stop it?
Well, it's difficult because this is a very clear statement of the law, and the decision now is in the hands of the clinicians who have to be in agreement with the families, and if that is the case, then the decision can be taken. Lady Black, who gave the ruling today, was very clear that if there is any doubt, if there is any disagreement, then the case can, and indeed it should, come back to court for court approval. But those who have real concerns about, I suppose what this amounts to is a great vote of confidence really in the medical profession and their ability to liaise with families, but those who are concerned about it will remain very concerned about it, and short of campaigning, there's not an awful lot legally which they will be able to do in these cases as far as I read this judgment.
Clive, thank you very much. Clive Coleman at the Supreme Court. Services cancelled following a timetable shake-up at Northern Rail have begun running again. It follows weeks of chaos for passengers after the train operator struggled to introduce a new timetable in May. It scrapped 168 services per day last month, leaving many travellers facing hours of delays if their trains ran at all. The Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham, has written to Theresa May asking her to intervene. Among the routes returning to normal is the Lakes Line, seen as vital for tourism in the Lake District. Rob Young reports.
Again, on behalf of Northern, I'd just like to apologise for the cramped.
This morning's 7:20 from Burnley to Leeds, one of dozens of Northern Rail services beset with problems in recent months. Commuters like Simon have had a miserable few weeks.
A lot of the times the train either doesn't turn up or it's actually too full to get on by the time it reaches my stop. It was so stressful I actually took time off work because when they changed the timetable, it was taking me upwards of 3 hours to get home on a 40-minute journey.
In May, rail timetables underwent the biggest shake-up in their history. It led to chaos on the North's rail network. Passengers endured long delays. Many trains didn't turn up. In an attempt to improve things last month, Northern Rail scrapped 168 daily services, further infuriating passengers. Today, 125 of those suspended journeys have resumed. It's been estimated the cancellations have cost businesses in the north £38 million. One of the worst affected lines, which runs through the Lake District, has been entirely out of action, sparking protests. All of its services are now back on the timetable. Local newspapers renamed the company Northern Fail and demanded the government sort the mess out. Today, the North's most powerful politician asked the Prime Minister to take charge of the issue.
I don't have the power. The Transport Secretary still has the power. But I've asked him and asked him and asked him to intervene. This isn't playing politics. I've said, please, intervene, do your job. And it's because I've run out of options that I've had to write to the Prime Minister.
The government has branded the rail disruption unacceptable and says an inquiry will work out what went wrong. The resumption of services today has not gone as smoothly as many had hoped. 23 Northern Rail services have been cancelled. Problems with signalling and drivers are to blame. Many of these passengers in Preston and Liverpool this morning weren't impressed.
It's been cancelled at very short notice. I was expecting a train at 6:07 and it's been cancelled because of lack of drivers.
They just don't seem to be improving, they don't seem to care. And when I put a complaint in months ago, I've heard nothing back from them.
After today, I'm hopeful that things will get back to normal.
The disruption isn't over yet. The remaining 43 of Northern's suspended services won't appear on the timetable until September. The company says a more gradual reintroduction will ensure a more stable and reliable service. But it will have been a long time coming. Rob Young, BBC News.
Our correspondent Dave Guest is at Preston Station. How's this gone down, Dave, with passengers?
Well, I have to say, I've been here since 5:30 this morning, and the first thing I heard when I arrived here was an announcement saying Northern apologised for the fact that they cancelled a train to Barrow. We've seen a number of cancellations here this morning and a number of delays, but nowhere near as bad as they were back at the beginning of June when they introduced that interim timetable and took out 168 daily services. Now, of course, they did that because the introduction of the timetable in May had caused them such problems. Basically, they didn't have enough drivers to run the number of trains they were trying to run. They said that their driver training programme had been derailed because electrification work on the track by Network Rail had overrun, and it all had a knock-on effect. So they brought in that interim timetable last month, took out 168 services, and as was said in that report, that included the Lakes line. Now, that caused a furore up there because, of course, this is the busiest time of the year for the Lake District. They want to get tourists up there on trains, so they will be very relieved that the service there has been reinstated today. Coming back to Preston, as I say, a number of cancellations, but they've been in the order of 10, 15 minutes, and probably a handful of cancellations. 20-odd cancellations across the network, Northern are saying, and they're saying a number of those have been because of signalling problems and what they're describing as infrastructure problems. So I have to say, some of the station announcements here have also blamed the fact that crews have been in the wrong place because of some disruption to the services. Talking to passengers here at Preston, as elsewhere, I don't think they're really bothered about who's caused this, what the problem is, who's trying to sort it out. They just want it sorted, and they want it sorted quickly. I've been talking to people today who've had to change their entire working patterns and the way they get to and from work because they just couldn't rely on the trains anymore. That's why Andy Burnham is so steamed up about this. That's why he's now calling on the Prime Minister to get involved. The Department for Transport itself has said that the problems up here have been unacceptable. We've heard that report from the Northern Powerhouse Partnership saying that all of this has cost businesses in this part of the world £38 million and has also lost about 1 million hours of travelling time, both for business and for pleasure. So it's been a huge effect up here. People will be watching closely to see whether these changes work today. Northern promising that tonight at rush hour they will be operating a good service. We will, of course, be watching to see whether they do.
A long day, but we're grateful to you. Dave Guest in Preston, thank you very much. With us is Roger Blake, Director of Infrastructure at Rail Future, an independent group which campaigns for a better rail network. Roger, thank you very much for coming in. Let's just be super clear about this. Northern Rail have not gone back to what the timetable that they used to run prior to these changes, have they? It's slowly changing and should be in place fairly soon. In
Our
full.
understanding of the situation as of today is that we are rebuilding in stages what should have happened in May and tragically didn't work. So the expectation is that come September we should have, all being well, what we ought to have had back in May.
And hopefully the ingenuity that passengers have had to show to get to where they've wanted to go to at all can ease off.
I think passengers have been expected to exercise a lot more than just ingenuity. I think they have very good cause to be very frustrated with all of this. The rail industry has let itself and its customers down badly, and it needs to rebuild the trust of its existing passenger base and the confidence in the wider public who may be thinking about rail but hearing all these bad news stories are put off. There is a major confidence building exercise which is now needed.
Yeah, so how is that trust rebuilt?
I think it's got to be just through communication. It can be simply good announcements at the stations. It can be staff on the trains explaining, if you're held up, if you're going slowly, try to give an explanation why, and if you don't know, then say, we're not quite sure what the problem is, we'll let you know when we can.
Now, we heard Dave Guest say that passengers have told him they don't care who's responsible, whether it's the train operating company, the government, they just don't care. But clearly there are component parts to who's responsible. Where does the government fit in? Where does Northern Rail fit in?
There are very many component parts in this very complex industry, and you're absolutely right that from the passenger point of view, they just want their trains to run as per the timetable and as per the expected time of arrival. It will be for others to conduct the many inquiries which are already set up, and the government has asked the Office of Rail and Road to set up an inquiry. The House of Commons Transport Committee are calling for evidence until the 5th of September. People have until tomorrow, actually, to fill in an online survey on the ORR website to contribute their own personal experiences.
Now, clearly, transport is a massively political issue, which may contribute to some of the problems with long-term planning. But what's missing from the rail network? You've mentioned customer service. Is it lack of skilled personnel, drivers, engineers?
I think the key thing that's missing is a strong sense of leadership from the centre.
The centre being the government?
The government is part of that, but I mean within the rail industry itself. There have to be good managers who inspire their staff to deliver the very best, and this is the train operators, it's Network Rail, and it's very fortunate that Network Rail are seeing the arrival of a new chief executive with established rail experience who we can be absolutely sure is going to really get a grip of this.
Roger Blake from Rail Future, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
You're watching Afternoon Live. These are our headlines. The Supreme Court rules legal permission will not be needed to end care for patients in a permanent vegetative state. Services scrapped in a timetable shake-up by Northern Rail begin running again, but passengers face more cancellations. Voting's underway in Zimbabwe in the first general election since long-time President Robert Mugabe was ousted.
And in sport, Geraint Thomas is celebrating his historic Tour de France victory. He became the first Welshman to win the Tour on Sunday and the third Brit to take home cycling's greatest prize, following in the footsteps of Sir Bradley Wiggins and Chris Froome, who finished third. Alistair Cook says he understands why the England selectors have made an exception in picking Adil Rashid for this week's first test against India. A dry summer, together with good form, has seen the Yorkshire leg spinner included in England's 13-man squad. And Andy Murray says it will be like starting from scratch again when he steps out on court in his first round of the Washington Open. He faces Mackenzie McDonald in just his third tournament since having surgery in January. And I'll have more on all of those stories just after past. See you then.
Voters in Zimbabwe are going to the polls in the first ever election which doesn't feature the name Robert Mugabe on the ballot paper. Mr Mugabe was ousted last year after almost 4 decades of controlling the country. In a surprise intervention yesterday, Mr Mugabe said he couldn't support his successor, Emmerson Mnangagwa, of the ruling ZANU-PF party, describing its leadership as tormentors. Our correspondent Shingai Onyoka sent this report from the capital, Harare.
Zimbabwe is bracing itself for a new beginning. Since independence from colonial rule in 1980, no election has carried such weight, so much expectation. Many here rose in the cold hours before dawn, eager to cast their ballot.
I'm declaring this polling station open at 7 o'clock.
Up to 5.7 million people are expected to vote today. So much depends on this election. This once promising Southern African nation has remained stagnant for 20 years. Many waiting in line have no jobs.
I come here to vote for my children so that they have to get jobs. This is what we want here in Zimbabwe, because I can't be a vendor. My child is a Form 6, then he's going to be a vendor also.
Since 1980, there was no freedom of speech. So I want to express that through my vote.
Today, Zimbabweans will decide their future. The two presidential frontrunners are both new to the race. Voters here are hoping that one of these men will draw the line on years of political instability and turmoil and finally turn this country around. Up above, one of the men who carries this country's hopes, Emmerson Mnangagwa, the current president, on his way to vote outside the capital. His stronghold, the rural areas, where close to 70% of voters live.
I'm happy that both the process for campaigning was peaceful. The voting today is peaceful.
This is the reception his rival received, confident the urban vote belongs to him. My colleague Fergal Keane spoke